Welcome to Midlife Matters. I'm Marie, and each week I'm joined by my friends Julie and Mindy to talk about all the topics keeping women in the middle years up at night. Today we're talking about money matters in midlife. Often married couples split household duties and just one partner ends up knowing where the money is, how much is invested, details about assets, and more. Today we're talking with a financial advisor who specializes in helping midlife women understand and manage their finances. Let's get started. Listeners, today we're going to be talking about money matters on Midlife Matters. And this is a topic that we've wanted to do for a while, as it's something that many of us know we should be more aware of, but we're not sure really where or how to start. And we're so excited to talk with our guest today, Maleah Stephens. Maleah is a financial advisor working primarily with single women who are either divorced or widowed. So I really think that you've probably got a lot of expertise in this area, Maleah.
Yes, I do. And it's my joy to work with these women.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, we're so happy to have you join us today on the podcast. And, I think that a lot of us, especially in this age group that are listening, a lot of us don't really know even what to ask sometimes or what we should be doing. But just in general, do you find that many women, even highly educated women, often have very little understanding of personal or family finances?
I think what I have found is a lot of the women I work with are thrown into a situation where they have to kind of get behind the wheel themselves, and it seems very scary. They all have the ability and the capability, and my goal is, I have Wise and Worthy as the brand I created, and the reason I created it was because all women have the ability and they are wise, and I want them to walk away from our relationship knowing that they're wise and they can take control. And that they're worthy to do so. So a lot of times when they're thrown in that situation, it's really that the security of what they've known are gone. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, even you said, a highly educated woman. She could be a small business owner, have several in mind. They're very business savvy, but for whatever reason, they've allowed their partner to kind of take the reins in finances because maybe their partner, it was a stronger strength, right? Mm-hmm. And so now if their partner has been removed, whether that's through a choice, through a divorce, through death, it becomes very scary because the security is gone. And so it's really about laying a foundation for them to just put their feet on. And then through some coaching, we kind of walk through the process.
Mm-hmm. And that all resonates very much with me right now. And just your words are already so comforting.
Good. I'm so glad
we're capable.
Yeah, you're 100% capable. It's one of my greatest joys about what I do is a year later, watching them come back into my office, and you can tell with their body language, the way they say hi, everything is different. And sure, of course, like there's been healing in that time because of whatever experience they've gone through, but it's more now they're coming in because I'm not a scary place to come. They're coming in because they got this. Mm-hmm. And for me, that makes everything worth it.
Yeah. Well, what I've found in marriage, and I've been married over 25 years, is that you tend to divide up life a lot of times. Mm-hmm. Sure. It's not that I couldn't do it, but you can't do it all. So you take the reins on some areas and your husband takes the reins on others. And the years just go by. And the longer you're out of an area, the harder it feels to get back into it. You hear these scary stories of women who are getting divorced and they don't know where any of the money is. And and you hear of like men hiding money or things that the women should have been aware of. What do we as women need to even be doing? Because it is impossible to do everything. And so if we're not having our hand in every bit of financial information, what should we have our hand in?
That's a great question. And I think there are a few different ways in which you could approach this. And a lot of this, I say, comes down to kind of how your marriage operates, right? Mm-hmm. From that business perspective. And some people, what they found is like a monthly meeting over coffee, not because they're getting into the nitty gritty, but just that their spouses are giving updates on where things are. I also highly recommend that at least once a year, you accompany your spouse. If you do have a financial advisor, you go to the meeting I always encourage my married clients, like, hey, I need both of you at least one of these meetings per year, or we can both jump on a phone call. And it's really just because I don't expect the other party to understand when I get into the nitty gritty about the investments or why it's invested that way. It's more about an understanding of what they have collectively and where it is, and also who to call. Okay. And I'm going to give you a story. This story is really one of the most defining stories that there's a couple that kind of spurred my career. So I actually worked with my father the first 6 years in the business. He's an advisor in Alabama. So this has happened when I was working with him. But we had a couple come in at 4:00 on a Friday. This man was my favorite client of my dad's. He was, the big old teddy bear. He was an attorney. He gave this persona that he was very gruff when really like his heart was just gold. And you just wanted to snuggle him. And he pretty much led, like, his wife was a stay-at-home mom. She raised the kids. Now our kids were off and they were having kids of their own and they had grandkids. But she would come to the meetings. That's like the takeaway, is like she would come with him to the meetings. That was on a Friday, and at 8 a.m. on Monday, my dad received a call that he had passed away that morning from a heart attack on the treadmill at the gym. And the point is that she called my dad because she didn't know what else to do.
Right.
But she knew that was a person who would be able to walk her through the steps to take.
Right.
And that has always stood out to me, because in this business, people think like it's just about your investments and it's just about your market returns and it's just about that. And really, this is a business about a relationship, to celebrate the highs and lows and to be able to coach. And so you want to know who that person is to call. So if at the very least, all you do is ask your spouse who to call if something happens, like that's the best thing that you can do. And then I also highly encourage like either monthly, quarterly meetings, just to kind of go over, make sure you know the logins to accounts, you know what banks your money is at, this is kind of a joke, but like, I'm not sure my husband knows, because it's just like in our relationship. And so there's been times where I'm like, hey, all the passwords are here. Hey, like call my business partner, Jay, if like something happens to me. And I think he thinks I'm joking, but I'm not. I'm serious. Because there's just a lot of things that come with this realization that either you're walking now down a road of divorce that you never imagined, or you're walking down a different road. It's not, because our brains can only function on so many cylinders and we can only handle so much emotional stress, because the emotional stress and toll that it takes on you is worse than any physical stress that you could ever be under. So to be proactive with these conversations.
Maleah, I'm really, really glad that you're bringing this up. And I've just had a friend just walk through that situation with her husband passing. It made my husband and I have a lot more conversations, different conversations. I think one of the first things is also in my marriage relationship, my husband is kind of the main person that he actually just loves doing it. And so why would I take that love from him?
Exactly.
I mean, why would I do that? So I don't want to steal his joy. If you find yourself in the situation with the death of a spouse, is there a list somewhere? Like, what do you even do first?
The first thing you have to do is to stop and take a deep breath, because there are so many to-dos, right? And then we know that naturally our brains start to shut down when we get overwhelmed, right? And that's why earlier when I said, if you just ask who you're supposed to call, because that one person, whether it's the accountant, whether it's the financial advisor, whether it's the attorney, they're going to say like, all right, next step is to do this, right? And a lot of times with the death, you've got to have a death certificate before anything else can get done, right? So people would automatically assume, hey, I just need to call the bank and let them know. But if you're not on the account, now you've just shut down access to the account, right? So you don't necessarily want to do that. And that's another good point. Like, you want to make sure you're either listed as a joint owner on all accounts, or we have what we call like a transfer on death, or a POD is a lot of times what the banking institutions call it, which is like a power on death, which essentially is a way to name a beneficiary on a checking account, a savings account, if you don't want to be joint owners. And I'm not going to get into the reasons why you wouldn't have joint ownership on things like that, but it allows you access upon death to those funds.
Okay.
Right. So that's just a common mistake that some people do, is they just like kind of jump the gun, when really like the first step is you just have to take a deep breath.
Yeah.
And then I say you have to make a list of the people to call.
Okay.
Right. And then you have to find, and again, these are where you've got to be proactive about some of these conversations. So I'm really glad you're having me on just to kind of answer these and put these thoughts out there. Is some people like to still do it the old school, I call it the old school way, where you have paper files.
Right.
And some people, it's all electronic. Well, in some cases, potentially to have a paper file could be easier, because you might can get your hands on it. So it's like, you've got to know where those paper files are, whether that's locked into like a safe deposit box at the bank. You got to know, hopefully wills have been done. If they haven't, that's like a whole nother thing. But with wills, you would call the estate attorney who wrote the will. That would kind of be the next step after that. If you have an advisor, you would call the advisor. If you have a CPA you work closely with, you would call the CPA. If you have I know it's rare these days with the younger generation, but a lot of you might have a personal working relationship with somebody at the bank. And assuming that you're on the accounts, then you call that person, because they're someone that you trust.
Right.
That will guide you.
Right.
And help ask you questions.
Well, what if it's not a death? What if it's a divorce, which is probably even more common, and you're not on the accounts, but this is what you've been living on? What do you do?
Right.
Yes. So that is where things, in some ways, are a little bit more, I would say, tricky, scary, even, right? Especially for women and let's say the divorce is not necessarily a mutual one. And, divorces are just, frankly, they get very messy. And in some ways, they can be just as hard, if not harder, than a death. Because at the end of the day, it is like a death. Get your hands on any type of statements that you can think of. So you would want to make a list of banks. You would want to just ask these simple questions. Do we have a checking account? Yes, you have a checking account. Okay, where is that checking account? It's at First Tennessee, or it's at Wells Fargo. Do we have a savings account? Where is the savings account? Did I ever have an IRA or an employer plan at a company I used to work for? Write that down, right? And what you're doing in this exercise is allowing your brain the ability to focus just on this one thing, which is there money and where would it be? So that then you can work off the list. Because if you just sit there and you don't make the list, then the next day you're going to be like, I don't know how to find it. I don't know how to find it. And you're going to focus on, I don't know how to find it, instead of, oh, I have this list and now I need to figure out where this account is at the bank. That makes sense. And then you make lists. Your husband have an employer plan, an IRA. Like, what are the assets? You're essentially writing down assets, and assets include your house. Do you have investment property? Do you have a boat? Do you have a lake house? We forget that all of these items are tangible items, and we call them assets.
Okay.
So you've got to make a list of them. That's the first step. Then there's other steps after that. But
yeah, well, that's really scary.
Yeah, it is really scary. And if you call an attorney, because then you think like, now I've got to get representation. And there's several different ways in which you could pursue some type of representation. They're going to ask you for that information right off the bat. So it's like, you're going to have to do that homework. The second step, and I just want to include this because I think it's vitally important. And it's a step that women and men, frankly, tend not to take. They don't know how much money they actually need to live on. So it's like they think like, oh, the mortgage, and I'm making up numbers. The mortgage is $2,000 a month, and I think our bills are $300 a month, and I probably spend $500 a month at a grocery store, and maybe my gas is $100 a month, and then I've got insurance. Well, all we've done now is say, I think, and what you actually find is when you sit down to look at the records, you could be off by $100, or you could be off by $1,500.
Oh my goodness. Well, so I have kind of a follow-up question for either scenario. we've kind of heard like don't make any major decisions for a year. Is this good advice? Why
great
not?
Advice.
Okay.
Yeah, let me give you a great example.
Okay.
I have a client who went through a divorce. They'd been married for 18 years, 2 kids. She worked part-time, but mostly she had stayed at home, and she is from another state. And so when she got divorced, she told me, I'm just going to move back to my home state. I want to be by my family. And I said, hey, I think it would be wise if we just hit pause. I'm not telling you not to. I'll help you figure out how to fund it and all these things. But I think we just need to hit the pause button and just kind of adjust to this new life that you find yourself in. Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Because essentially what we're doing when we make these rash decisions is searching for what we think is going to make us happy.
Right.
Right. And really what we're doing is just putting a Band-Aid on the wound and the pain and the hurt. But she didn't take my advice, and that's okay. Like, I can lead a horse to water, but I can't make them drink, kind of thing all the time. She moved back to Nashville 6 months later.
Mm-hmm.
So now we had 3 house transactions within a year.
Whereas, a lot of expenses.
And had she just taken the time to just be, and it's painful. Like there's no way around it. It is. And we don't like pain. It's not comfortable. And so she thought being by her family would make her happy. And while it did, and thankfully this was pre-COVID, because I can't imagine what would have happened during COVID. But then she realized why she moved from there in the first place, because she hates really cold winters. So she had to come back.
Gosh, I know grief is hard, but really what comes next could even be harder if it affects your finances. So I'm glad we're talking about this. And I'd just like to add that the 3 of us have talked about having this episode on finances for a while. And had we recorded this just a few weeks ago or even a few months ago, I would have thought this was for somebody else, that I don't have to think about this yet because, I'm 54 years old and things have changed in my life that I am now very interested in this topic. And I just want to say my husband has done an excellent job preparing for the future and for the what ifs of life, but I have not been engaged in that process. And we just haven't sat down until very recently and talked about the what ifs. And, we did make wills when our children were young, but we're just now like getting power of attorney and living wills set up. Like, what should couples be talking about early on when they don't think they need to?
One of the most important topics that families can discuss, and when I refer to this, I call it the foundation of your financial plan. Okay. Is your estate documents. It's your will. It's your power of attorney. It's your healthcare directive. It's if you're going to have a trust of some kind for some reason, it's putting that in there. And I would even argue, if you had them done when your kids are little, you need to revisit them. And then I'm not saying because they need to be changed, but they might. Right. Life happens, things happen. And we just want to make sure that we have, dotted our I's and crossed our T's as far as the estate documents go. And a lot of times what we see is we'll have these estate documents done. And let's just say somebody does want to have what they call a pop-up trust. Okay. That just essentially means upon their death, a trust comes into existence. Okay. A lot of times you might do this if you have young kids at home who aren't of age yet. Right. And so if something, and this is a morbid thought, but if something were to happen to both of you, do you want to just leave this money outright to your 8-year-old? Probably not. So a lot of times attorneys will say, let's do a pop-up trust. It just comes up at your death. But the problem is if you don't then go and do what we call funding the trust, meaning name the beneficiary, the contingent beneficiary, the trust, then the trust actually doesn't get funded and the money still has to go through probate.
Okay.
So that's one thing. The other thing, especially for young couples, and I know this probably is, maybe not in your average listener, but it's also very important, even if you have teenage kids, is do you have a guardian named? We absolutely don't want to think that is something we're ever going to have to face. But I have a friend who was raised by the guardians her parents named.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So these are things that happen, and in order to protect our children, that's why you're doing it. These conversations aren't fun. They're heartbreaking to even like have and imagine, but they're also a necessary part.
Yeah, even more heartbreaking if you haven't done it and you're having to do it
alone
or at a time when a lot of other emotional things are going on.
And also when you do that, you then need to tell the people, there's also another step. I think it's like sometimes we say these things and we put it on paper and then we've forgotten to inform kind of thing. So I'll just use myself, like I did this and I know better. I tell people not to do this. But my dad was like, I'm assuming, like, I've made this assumption about who you and Scott named as a guardian for towns. Am I right in my assumption? And I was like, you are. I should have told you that, And frankly, my dad probably only asked because he's an advisor and he's telling clients the same thing,
Well, Maleah, how often should we update these documents? Just real quick. I'm curious what your advice would be.
I would say every 5 to 7 years, you should review them. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to update them. It's just to review them to make sure what you decided 5 years ago is still your wishes.
Okay.
And then if you have any major life events, obviously, if you go through a divorce, you need to update your estate documents, right? You've got one of the most common things that gets kind of forgotten about once you get to the other side, if you don't have someone kind of helping you along the way, is changing beneficiaries, getting your estate documents updated.
When things happen in life, who should you look to for financial help? Obviously, there's a lot of friends and family that offer advice. Do you recommend? Sure. Is that a good source of information, or do you find that can cause problems?
Depends on if that advice is solicited or unsolicited, right?
In all of life.
In all of life, yes. Normally, what I would recommend is I would always ask friends and families, hey, do you have a person? And what I mean by that is, do you have a financial advisor? Do you have a CPA that you trust and you use? And if the answer is yes, then you just ask who it is. Because what I've found in my business is referrals are given by the people who are your big fans, right? Who appreciate what you do, value you, love you. And so if they're willing to tell you yes, then you can trust that because they obviously trust. Because trust is really what we're talking about here, right? This is your money. This is very personal. I tell people like money is 98% emotional and 2% logical.
Right.
And you know who you need for the 2% logical? You need the outside source, the advisor. Okay. And so if they're willing to give you a name of someone they work with, then that means they trust them. Now, does that mean you should just go in and automatically trust them? No, it's a relationship. Those types of things, I call it a jar of marbles. You have to build the trust. It's just like any relationship, right? But you go in and meet them. And if you feel great about speaking with them, and talking with them and you believe you trust them, then you move forward. I tell people when I meet them first, like, this doesn't mean we have to work together. This is to see if we feel good about working with one another, because my ultimate goal is a partnership.
Okay.
Well, what kind of financial advisors are there, Maleah? Because you hear different words thrown around, commission-based, fee-based.
Right.
So I will say, I believe this industry can be tricky. It can be intimidating. And yes, you're right. There's different words like commission-based and fee-based. The industry as a whole, so let me just kind of talk about the industry as a whole, is moving more towards the fee-based side of things. There's been different regulations passed on our industry in the last 8 years or so that is kind of moving the needle to more fee-based. But what I tell people is more so than just like, are they commission-based or fee-based, is more that you have an understanding of how they're getting compensated. So one of the things about our industry is that we are typically compensated on assets under management. Okay, so that just means like if we're managing investments for you, that is actually how we're paid, unless there's other cases where you might pay an advisor to do a financial plan for you and those kinds of things. But just for the basis of this conversation, you're getting paid on assets under management. So that's tied to the investments. But yet the advisor might have spent a year walking you through, going with you to the estate attorney to get those documents done, making sure your life insurance is reviewed, making sure that your homeowners and auto was reviewed appropriately, making sure all the titling is done correctly, making sure the beneficiaries are lined up. They've done all of this other planning for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the way the compensation schedule typically in this industry works, as it's tied to assets under management. And I think that just trips people up. So I just always say, you just want to make sure you understand. You ask the question, how are you paid? Because it's a fair question. You have, full disclosure is everyone is in a rightful place to have that. And then make sure you understand. Why.
Are there any other questions that we should be asking at that first meeting that you would say, yes, ask these questions?
I really like to spend that first meeting getting to know the person. So I always tell people, we're probably not going to touch on everything you thought we were going to touch on today. Meaning you probably came in with your account statements and you're expecting me to look at the investments. And yes, that's a big piece. I mean, that's a piece of what we do, but it's not the most important piece. Right. And so you want to make sure the advisor is looking at your situation from a holistic standpoint. And they've asked questions about, have you had your homeowners and auto reviewed recently? Have you had your estate documents updated? And these things that they're asking about, they don't do. Right. But it's a part of, so I have my CFP, which is Certified Financial Planner. So I'm approaching everything from a very holistic standpoint. I want to make sure your foundation is set up correctly, because without a foundation, it's harder to move to the next level, which is more your savings, your retirement plan, your strategy behind what you're doing.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Wow. Well, heaven forbid that we should have to talk about this, but we do. Do you have any advice for protection against fraud? Because I imagine that a new widow might happen to be seen as an easy target for a scam.
Unfortunately, you were right. The best things that you can do is set up the protection on your credit, like through the 3 credit agencies, so that your Social Security number is getting screened, essentially. And also, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of credit card companies nowadays offer a free service of just, do you want to sign up for a credit screen? Do you want to sign up for us to essentially be screening your purchases, in the sense that, not screening it in the sense that they're watching every single thing you do, but they're watching for things that don't match your spending behavior.
Okay.
Right. So that means if you're in Nashville, Tennessee, in the last 3 days, you've spent money in Nashville, Tennessee at the grocery store to get gas or, whatever. And then all of a sudden a charge in Florida pops up. Now the credit card company is alarmed.
Right.
The other thing I also tell, especially older widows, if you ever have a question about a call you get, because now we know they're phishing, right? And calling. Yeah. It's not, the old way of doing things was mail, right? And they would ask for donations, and then these little widows would write checks. But nowadays, they're calling you. You never, ever give your financial information to somebody who has called you unless you know them.
Oh, great advice.
You only give it if you called them. Because now you have these scams that are posing themselves as like the IRS. Well, we all kind of have a moment when we think the IRS is calling us.
Right.
Yeah. I say the worst surprises are the IRS surprises.
I know. Right? I just see Martha Stewart in jail all over again.
Goodness. So it's like, if somebody calls and says they're from the IRS, I got a call a few weeks ago and it sounded so real that I even inherently knew it wasn't, but I had to ask my husband to make sure. Because they said there was a warrant out for my arrest. And I was like, did I not pay a speeding ticket? And I got it twice before I finally asked him. He's like, that's a scam.
We get that call all the time.
Exactly. So it's like, I always tell these widows or single women, if you have a question, call someone you trust and you ask them, hey, do you think this is legit or not? Okay. So it's just that rule of accountability. We had a client, and unfortunately she called. She thought she had won the publisher sweepstakes for like $500,000 or something. And we were like, no, that's a scam. Do not give them any information. But she was elderly. And so to your point, she's been a widow for a while, but she's a widow and she's elderly. And we had to call her daughter to let her daughter know, like, hey, your mom thinks that she potentially won this. Just wanted to give you a heads up. It's not legit. And we were able to finally convince her, but it took us a week to convince her that it wasn't. Yeah, it took a long time to convince her that it wasn't real.
Wow. Well, Maleah, in your experience, do you see clients who were once unprepared and anxious becoming financially savvy over time? Please say you do.
Oh, yeah. Going back to what I said earlier, it's like my joy about what I do is when I can see a difference before they even say hello. I see how they walk into my office and I know they're different. And I also I call them those light bulb moments. So I tell clients like, hey, we're going to talk about a lot and your eyes are going to glaze over and you're going to say, Maleah, I'm never going to get this. I have no idea what you're saying. And I say, we're going to go over it every meeting. And there will be one meeting that you look at me like, I know what that means now. And so you see that it's just a continual process. I like to say they didn't build Rome overnight. Right.
Yeah.
And so we have to allow ourselves that same grace and understanding that we're going to get there. It's just going to be a process of learning.
Do you find clients that just want you to handle it all like their spouse may have done, or do you try to get them more involved?
I tell them my biggest thing is education. So if you want me to, handle it in the sense that like I'm handling your investments, I'm making it, I'm doing advice on that. But we are always talking about it. I want you to have an understanding as to the why behind what we're doing. And so it's just a continual conversation. They really don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But what I find is like, they might push back on me those first couple, meetings or, the stonewall is what I call it when they're just sitting there and I'm like, they're really not listening, but we're going to talk about this anyway. But what I found is by like the third or fourth meeting, they've now become engaged because it's not intimidating anymore. It's not scary. I had a client one time tell me, you do a really good job of dumbing this down. And she didn't mean dumbing. She just meant communicating in a way that she could understand it.
Yeah. All the terms are so confusing and it just goes over my head. I've been to those meetings, but I feel like I don't even know what they're talking about half the time. Once all the urgent things are settled, I guess it's time to start planning for our future. So let's talk about investing a little. I've read that after a divorce, you may have a full bank account from a settlement, or after a death of a spouse, you might have a life insurance benefit. So what do you do with all that money?
That's a great question. And the first thing we have to do is figure out our goals and our wants. For a lot of women, it's security and to know that there's financial security in the future. And then the question is, well, how do I achieve that, right? If women still have children in the home, then the children might actually be the top priority and making sure they're taken care of and that they get off to college and they get to fly the nest, so to speak, and the mom can make sure they've got everything they need. So we really have to kind of line that out first before we can decide what to do with the money, right? And I mentioned this before that I tell people like the investments are important because yes, they do help us achieve long-term goals, but they're not the most important in the beginning. The most important is asking these questions so that we can understand what is it that you want to achieve so that we know how to help you get there and put together the strategy and that strategic plan that kind of backs that up. And then educate you as to why we're making those recommendations.
Yeah, because I can imagine I would be so fearful as to, my first question would be, how do I know how long I'm going to live? Like, will I outlive my investments? Like, how do you?
That's a great question.
Figure that out.
We have software that we do all this analysis with. That's the really fun. Well, from my perspective, I can see Marie's face right now and she's like, that sounds awful. It's really fun because I get to use this software and I get to ask you all these questions. And then I take what you say and I tell people, I like to make them very conservative. So I'm ultimately showing you worst case scenario. My favorite thing is when I know just based on what you told me, what it's going to, spit out. But you don't know, and you're like dreading the worst, right? It's like you have that ignoring syndrome, like you just threw the statement on top of the fridge. But I'm like, hey, we don't need to ignore this. This is going to be great.
All right, so a little different direction. But if you've never had a credit card in your own name, do you recommend it? Like, is this a good way or an important way to build credit?
The answer is actually yes. I tell people, though, they're always like, this is contrary to what you're supposed to do. But I only would recommend that to someone who is wise with their money. Just meaning they're good at how they spend it, how they go about spending it, and they know how to live on what they have, right? Okay. I would never charge somebody with going to take out a credit card if they don't know how to be mindful of what they're doing. But it is absolutely a good way to build credit.
Well, are you saying that if you've had a joint account, like with your husband and credit card,
you count? It goes.
Do we do count or no? Okay, yes, it does count.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It does count. If you're a joint, it does count.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Also, like, and that's not just credit card. You're building credit if you're on the mortgage. You're building credit if you're on a car note. You're building credit in any type of note, or I hate to call it a debt, a liability you might have. You're building credit if you're on it.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that is not on here, but I would highly recommend, is that everybody pulls their credit once a year. You get a free credit report every year. It's also something I recommend when women find themselves facing a divorce situation that they weren't expecting, is that they should also pull their credit.
Oh, okay. Because it'll tell you what? What will it tell you?
It'll tell you what your debts are. Oh. And to make sure there's no surprises.
Because you might not know about them.
Correct. Because ultimately, if you've been married, you are in a very intimate relationship where I'm never going to paint a picture where you can't, you're not going to trust your spouse, but I'm speaking from my own personal experience. I've been divorced, and thankfully he didn't put any of this stuff in my name. But when I pulled our credit during that experience, I was very shocked at what I found. And very grateful it was not in my name.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
so
I know
it's just something that we need to do.
We get in the habit, like, Steve will bring me a paper. Oh, can you sign here?
Correct.
I don't really ask him too many questions,
because you have a mutual trust.
Right.
There's a trust there.
Right.
Yep.
But I could see how you could end up with some debts that you weren't aware of.
Yeah.
And so just pulling your credit is just another way of making yourself a part of the process. And it's never because if something does pop, let's just say something pops up that you weren't expecting. Maybe you did actually know about it and you just forgot.
Right.
Maybe you and Steve talked about it and then you've just forgotten because you're not the one paying the bill. Right. And so it just allows you to go and ask a question, not to accuse.
Right.
So you're a marriage counselor too.
Yeah. Well, I've been called that a time or two. I did have a meeting one time where I just helped them learn how to communicate with one another.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, can you repeat what you heard them say? Okay, now can you repeat what you heard them say?
I could see that because Bryce and I speak different financial language. And so sometimes it takes like going through it and like asking more questions to try to understand, like, oh, okay, well, why didn't you just say that? Like, I understand that.
Yes. And we think differently.
Such an emotional topic. I mean, they say that divorce, one of the leading causes is financial issues, So do you find that women tend to invest less aggressively than men?
I would say not necessarily less aggressively, although maybe starting out, right? If we're just dipping our toe in the water and we're getting comfortable with this idea of investing because it's not that our money hasn't ever been invested, it's that we've never been in charge of it, then yes, it might start that way. But really what women do is they ask great questions. They want to know the whys behind it. Women actually tend to be more passionate about what they're investing in. And what I'm going to say is women don't chase returns the way men do, which means they don't make knee-jerk reactions, which means they fare better in the long run.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, it sounds like you obviously love your job, Maleah. Like it's a great passion of yours. And I appreciate all the advice that you've given us today. How did you get into this job? Was this something that you always wanted to do?
So that's kind of a peeling back an onion. So if you'll allow me a minute, I'll peel it back for you. I think as I was growing up, obviously my dad is an advisor. And I would hear him talk about it, but I just knew that I loved numbers and I loved math and I was good with dates. And so I think I was naturally drawn to something that had to do with, numbers. I started in accounting in college, which would have just been a bad decision. And my dad introduced me to a lady who became kind of like a mentor to me, who ran the financial planning program at the University of Alabama. And it was not in the business school, so most people would think it would be in the business school. But what financial planning, as far as this career goes, it's really dealing with individuals, whereas finances is dealing with companies, businesses, more corporate, big picture. And I just really enjoyed the curriculum, and I loved this woman, right? And so I decided, okay, maybe even though some things like sounded very scary, like taking the CFP, which is like a 13-hour test, and like, how would I do that? And then just like working, and you have to have so many years of experience before you can call your advisor. Like, it seemed very overwhelming as a sophomore in college, but I just decided I would do some internships and give it a shot. And then along the way, in my career, I started out working with my dad after I did an internship in DC, and then I did some other internships, and then I joined my dad's practice before I ultimately landed in Nashville in 2012. But along the way, as far as my passion for helping women goes, it came through several different experiences. One I've already shared about the woman who lost her husband. The other one was actually one of the very first client meetings I ever sat in on with my dad. And this woman had been married for 30 years, raised 4 children, and then her husband just left. And I was extremely moved and impacted by this meeting and watching how my dad handled her with such care and kindness and empathy. And she came into the meeting sobbing and left the meeting different, you know? And I thought, man, that made a difference. And like, that really helped somebody. And then I went through my own divorce. And I remember a couple months after, kind of in the middle of that process, and I thought, whoa, like, I know what I'm doing. And what I mean by that is like, I know what I'm doing when it comes to money. Like, this is what I'm good at. And what if you weren't? And I kind of asked myself that question, like, that must be like my security, because at the time, my first husband, that's what he was to me. Like, he was security. I had someone there to always talk to. I didn't need his help to figure out myself financially, but I am the one in a million. And so I thought, like, there is a way to serve here and make these women know that they are very more than capable of doing it, and giving them the confidence to do that.
Well, you certainly do exude a lot of confidence, and I just love your attitude towards it. It's wonderful.
Me too. I've learned so much, and I just appreciate it, because I think it's one of those, you mentioned, you put the statement on the top of the fridge, you're like, just don't think about it. I just don't quite understand it, but I appreciate you're instilling confidence, and it's very encouraging.
Yes, I appreciate your encouraging attitude.
Good.
Well, Maleah, if listeners are local and they would like to come and see you and share in your exuberant advice, where would they find you?
They can go to www.wiseandworthy.com, and that's my website, and it should have all my contact information, phone number, email, and there's even a link that would link to my calendar if they wanted to just see if they could book some kind of appointment. It should be available through that website.
Yeah, and just because I'm so unfamiliar, if someone did book a first appointment with you, is there a fee for that?
No.
Okay.
We call that, or I call that, I can't speak for everyone in the industry, but I call that a consultation. And it's really just hey, let's get to know each other. Let's see if we've got some synergy and some mutual trust, and we want to pursue going forward. And if not, that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Yes, I love that attitude. All right, Maleah, before we close, we have a section of our show that we call I'm a Fan. And Maleah, I would love to find out what you're a fan of this week.
Well, I'm a really big fan of basketball.
Oh, perfect time of year.
The timing is great because the tournaments start this weekend, and I'm so grateful that we're going to have them this year. And then March Madness is going to kick off next week, and I will have basketball on 24/7. Even on my desk, I'll probably have my iPad. It will be streaming.
Do you win your bracket?
Yeah, I beat Scott all the time. And I tell him anytime he's going to place a bet, I should be the one that fills out his bracket.
Okay. That's great. Well, Julie, what are you a fan of this week?
I'm a fan of a Netflix movie that I just watched called The Dig. It's based on a true story and a book of the same name. And it's kind of on the eve of World War II. So that checks the box for me. And it's about an amateur archaeologist excavator. And he's hired by this woman, Edith Pretty, to dig up these mounds that are on her private property. And they uncover an Anglo-Saxon ship. And in it is a burial chamber. And all these almost perfectly preserved artifacts are in the burial chamber. And I loved it because of the time period. It makes you feel like you've just been in the English countryside. It's beautiful. I love Lily James. She is the lead, one of the actresses. And all those artifacts are now found in the British Museum, and we have seen them twice. That was a highlight, just to know that I remember seeing all those treasures. So
I've heard a lot of people talk about that, and I think it's one of the more popular things on Netflix right now. So I definitely encourage listeners to check it out.
Yeah.
All right, Mindy, what are you a fan of this week?
Well, I'm always a fan of the classic white button-down shirt. And so it always looks good and never goes out of style. I recently found one at Target, though, that I am loving. It is the women's long-sleeve button-down boyfriend shirt by Universal Thread. I will say that I sized down 2 sizes.
Oh, wow.
Because clothes right now are made bigger, baggy. I really wasn't going for that look. But when I sized it down 2 sizes, it's perfect. I can wear it, like I can tie the front and the back is just a little bit longer. But the way the seam is made on the side, you can tie the front really cute with a pair of jeans. It is adorable. Or you can let it loose and it just hits right. And it's $20. I'm in love with this shirt.
Going to order right now.
Yes.
Thanks for the tip.
Great. Yeah. Yes. I will put a link to that for any listeners that also want to order right now in our show notes. Well, this week I'm a fan of a novel by Kristen Hanna, and many of you may know her from The Nightingale. I don't know. I know, Julie, you read The Nightingale. Did you read it, Maleah?
I did. I love her. I read most of her books.
Yes. Have you read her book, The Four Winds?
It's on my to-read next book list.
It was really good. It's about a subject that I don't know a lot about, the Dust Bowl. In those years in America. And I learned so much, and I found myself Googling back to see, did this really happen in history? And I thought it was a good story. It kept my attention, and I learned a lot. So if you are a fan of Kristen Hanna, The Four Winds is one that you should definitely pick up.
Nice.
All right. Well, Maleah, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yes.
Listeners, we would love for you to contact us by email, midlifematterspodcast@gmail.com, or come and find us on Instagram. We will be sharing some things about finances this week. I'm not sure what, but I bet Maleah has some resources that we can share with women, and we will definitely highlight her business. And we thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Loved it so much, Maleah.
All right. We'll talk to you guys next week.
All right.
Bye.
We're so happy you joined us today. You can find the show notes for this episode at midlifematterspodcast.com. Also, please tell a friend about the show and help them hit the free subscribe button on their favorite podcast app. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Midlife Matters Podcast. That's where we post pictures and stories about all the things we talk about in each episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.